Welcome back to the Sad Data Games podcast, where we talk about the saddest games out there. We are continuing our conversation with The Last of Us Part 1. We're going to be talking about Pittsburgh, or in the show, as it's known to be Kansas City. And we're going to be continuing the conversation up until Henry and Sam and how that story arc ends. So let's get into it today. Anybody at the top of this want to point out what was their favorite moment and something they want to call out?
This chapter for me is where the remastered game made its money for me. The scene with Ellie and Sam in the room by themselves talking, just the facial expressions gave it a whole new feeling compared
Mm.
to what it was the first time I played through on the PS4 version.
Yeah, there was a lot of like hesitancy in the gaming community about whether or not it merited the $70 price tag of like a new game. And me just being who I was, I just went ahead and got it because I don't care about the critics and the haters. And I told Tucker about this. I said, the game earns its money because of the micro expressions of these nuanced scenes in the mocap, the way that it immerses you more than you've ever experienced before. It has now, on every time I play through it, the same emotional impact that I had the first time I played the game when those nuances weren't there, that I started to lose. And now I can feel it every time.
This isn't the biggest moment from this chapter at all, but it's something that stuck out to me again because I didn't remember it really from before, or maybe it didn't hit me like before. But when they're climbing the rooftops, running away, and the ladder falls down, and Ellie goes up with Henry and Sam, and Joel is left beneath, and Henry says, "Sorry, we're leaving. We're out of here." And Ellie
Mm.
jumps back down to rejoin Joel and says, "No, we're in this together." I don't know why, but that moment hit me so hard this time around. That moment of camaraderie, that real shift for Ellie. Like, she could have run off with Henry and Sam right there, but for some reason that moment got me a little emotional. Like, she was willing to jump back down and die with Joel rather than run off with
Yeah.
these pretenders.
Well, and it's like it's more than just a moment. It's character growth of her expressing that she's just as in it as he. Well, I don't know that has he had that moment for her. She's expressing that she's there for him, but now he needs to reciprocate, unless I'm missing something. All right, so let's just circle back up to the top. So we just left Billstown in Lincoln, and then they hit the road and they are forced. I don't know that they explained it in the game, but I assume that they need supplies, and so they're going through a city. And they ended up getting funneled down the street without realizing it. This was a trap that had been constructed to funnel them through the town. You see this in a map later in the game of how they blocked the roads to funnel their prey. And at this time, raiders try to deceive them. They have this whole calculated, planned, choreographed thing to be able to take people. I assume as raiders, right, their entire motive is to kill people and take their supplies just to survive. Like, is it really just that they're organized, the impetus behind the group?
It's interesting in the game, I noticed they call them hunters, and it's
Uh,
hunters, and I think that is a very apt for these guys, especially when you see the two guys. I think they're like in a truck or something, and they mow down two people running away,
hmm.
and then they like look for their shoes, and oh, it's an old pair of shoes, no food. Well, that was, I can't remember exactly what they said, but it was almost like, well, that wasn't worth the ammunition we used. Really killing these two people just trying to live, and so I think they are hunting to survive.
I think I called it Raiders. Is that Fallout? I just played that as well. What am I referring to? Because they are hunters.
Raiders or Fallout, yeah.
Okay, that must be where I conflated the
Shan's
terms.
getting his post-apocalyptic wasteland all mixed up.
Classic.
Yeah,
They are they're
Yeah,
carbon copies of each
yeah,
other.
they're exactly the same,
I
indistinguishable.
love the choreography of this opening sequence. You can analyze Joel's character, or you understand. I think this whole chapter really starts to dig into like who Joel was in the interim phase between 20 years ago when Sarah was taken from him and now. And you already know that he is now on the opposite side of the law, quote unquote. And clearly, there was an even darker past where he just was surviving and taking people's lives unapologetically, even innocent people, as they allude to later with Ellie. And so, the opening sequence, you see, like, I know this game. I invented this game. Let me tell you, they're out to kill us. Be very careful or try to mow these people down unapologetically.
Which gives us the great line, he ain't even hurt.
He ain't even hurt.
He ain't even hurt. He just sees through BS because he's played both sides.
He's a pro fence sitter.
Exactly. And so it's interesting about his character, right? Because he's been both like a law-abiding citizen to being recalcitrant on the opposite side of the spectrum. And why does he end up falling back here? Still towards, anti-establishment, but he still conforms to a degree. What do you think like motivates where he's at now compared to where he was?
I think we've talked a lot about how pragmatic Joel is. I think it ultimately boils down to like, I think we touched on in an earlier episode when he's in Boston and he's a smuggler, is he's just like, I found a way to kind of do what I need to do to get by, and this is where I can do that. And I think that for me, it just kind of boils down to like, he's good at smuggling. He's found a thing that he can do. This is where he's going to do it. And I think that that's kind of why he's not like actively trying to fight against the law. He's just like, I'm going to take care of myself. I found this thing that I can do, and I'm just going to do it for as long as I can.
Yeah, he has a foundation of like pragmatism that allows him to live in the quarantine zone, even though he's against organizations in general. But yeah, it's the pragmatism of he just wants to live. But then he still has like the grit of that American hustle spirit that you see in his backstory as being a construction worker, but still wanting to be an entrepreneur to get ahead. It's like, okay, this is my baseline for survival, but I'm still going to hustle in that system. And now it's anti-establishment where I'm taking advantage of people, or I'm selling and smuggling things.
So something I just thought of is one of the main evolutions Joel goes through, really from this point to the end of the game, is that pragmatism. I don't know what the
Pragmaticism, yeah.
Pragmaticism.
Yeah, exactly.
Sorry, I was wrong.
Out,
right.
Yeah, gets worked out by Ellie. His relationship with Ellie, that starts to drop till the end of the game. It's not about Joel at that point because there's nothing pragmatic about what he does. Sorry.
Yeah, so there's like almost nothing pragmatic about sacrificing your own life to take care of somebody else, but that is like the trade-off of being pragmatic is becoming altruistic and what you have to sacrifice to get there.
Yeah, so I think that's just what we see the evolution of Joel, and I think this is kind of step one. The first chapter in Boston, quarantine zone, escaping is, I think, setting the base of who Joel is. And now we're seeing a little bit of Joel's past, but the starting point of moving on to Joel's actual character evolution.
Well, I think the next part is really cool. I love like right after they crash and you just see Joel immediately go into like, I don't want to say panic mode, but he's just like, grab your stuff, get out of the car, and immediately into a defensive position. And then they get attacked by these two hunters, and that hunter jumps on Ellie and a hunter jumps on Joel and like smashes his head there in some kind of convenience store. He smashes his head through like the glass. And then there's this glass shard right underneath Joel's neck, and the guy is trying to push Joel's neck into this glass shard. And they do this beautiful, awesome camera angle where you just get like the corner of Joel's eye, and he gets this look on his face that doesn't look human. He like turns into an animal, and he hits the guy and then just slits his throat on that piece of glass and then goes and runs over to help Ellie. And I think that's one of the first real instances where we get to see Joel being hyper protective of his, I'm going to call Ellie his ward, right? Like Ellie is in danger and Joel's, Papa Bear instincts kick in, and he gets this look in his eye like, I will kill everything in between.
That's exactly the phrase I was going to use for that moment, was Papa Bear. I was like, Joel goes full on Papa Bear right there. And I don't know if that survival instinct has just like always been innate with him. I think we talked about this a lot in the first episode where that fight instinct comes with him. But yeah, that's the first moment where you just see like that feral, I'm going to kill a mofo look in his eye. And I think it has as much to do at that point in the story with Ellie as his like innate "I'm gonna survive" because I correct me if I'm wrong, but like even though they've just gotten out of the car, he's aware that there's a hunter on top of Ellie, right? This didn't just happen so fast that he didn't clock that Ellie's in trouble.
No, a hunter attacks Ellie and then attacks him. He goes to Ellie, he's like, get your stuff, get out of the car. And then as they're doing that, they both
Right.
attack.
Yeah. Okay. So I remember having the thought, like, this is not just about Joel saving his skin. This is definitely about Ellie. That, like, I'm gonna turn feral and I'm gonna kill somebody.
Yeah.
That's when he has his like Herculean moment of, I'm going to kill this guy, get over
Yeah.
there. So now to kind of establish the setting, we just got to Pittsburgh, and in the show it's Kansas City. And I think that was just like a practicality of filming in Canada, and they needed a city that was like Midwestern,
It looked like
but
Canada.
and
Yeah.
and Kansas was easier to do. Generally, I think it probably says about the same thing. Like we have gone from early America to now where industrial America really took hold. And so I think it's just fun to see that progression of like American history and Americana that is a backdrop to this whole thing. But another opportunity to just have like claustrophobic setting and show overgrowth that really demonstrates the decay of 20 years.
Yeah, I really enjoyed the setting for this Pittsburgh part. I think they have this really cool interaction with the hunters where they kind of have to go through this initial escape, and then this is a really combat heavy part of the game where there's not a lot of downbeats. You go kind of from one area to the other and to combat encounter to combat encounter, and it really creates this feeling of like we're trapped in this city with all of these people that want to kill us. But another thing that I really appreciated about the game is that a lot of times in video games, you're soaking up bullets and you're just you're like, I'm just charging through everything, and it feels sort of detached from reality. But even on normal difficulty, if you are doing like a decent job of playing and trying really hard to be sneaky and not get hit, it feels relatively plausible that one person could sneak through and wipe out as many people as Joel does. I mean, there's still a little bit of suspension of disbelief because it is a video game, but I remember feeling like Joel could probably do this. Like if this was a real situation, someone like Joel could probably come out of this and with a body count this high. And even kind of towards the end of the area, the hunters start talking about the two of you, Joel and Ellie, where they're like, we got to find this guy. He wiped out how many people? And they have this almost like boogeyman way of talking about Joel where they're like, we have to get this dude because he's wiped out like half our people. Like, we got to find him.
He turns into John Wick a little bit.
Yeah, a little bit.
Yeah.
In addition to the setting of Pittsburgh, we established that they also had a military quarantine zone. This was Fedra. They tried to establish something, but you see a lot of storytelling in this section of how it fell and how it fell to the hunter specifically. So what is that whole dynamic like? This is often like background catalyst for action sequences in the game is using Fedra or hunters or something to move action sequences along and give you some variability. But like, what does the hunters versus Fedra story tell? Because we've already seen fireflies in Fedra. So what does this do differently?
I have thoughts, but I feel like I've been talking a lot. Does anyone else want to jump in?
I don't have thoughts on this. Go for
Okay.
it.
Well, one of the things that I really liked about this part is I feel like it does a good job of illustrating the difference between hunters and the fireflies. There's lots of different kind of factions that are all pushing against Fedra in one way or another. The fireflies are really, they're trying to restore law and order, and then the hunters are in their own way kind of trying to restore their own form of order, which is anarchy, basically. It's this skewed version
Organized
of order.
anarchy.
Organized anarchy, yeah, which is an oxymoron. But and you find this really cool note while you're exploring, at least I did, where talks about like it's a note from someone when this quarantine zone fell to the hunters and how they were like the person in charge of the hunters was like, okay, now we have to go out and start hunting people and stealing their stuff. And not everyone was on board. And so they killed those people. And it's I'm not, I'm paraphrasing obviously, but I thought that was a cool dynamic to be like, oh, so it wasn't just taken over by a bunch of murder crazy hunter people. It was like a society that like they kind of got a little farther away from civilization by degrees until they got to the point where they became these hunters that are just killing really anyone they come across and stealing their stuff as a way to survive.
With the hunters just in that whole fall of Pittsburgh from Fedra quarantine zone, to me, it felt like, just based on writing on the walls, notes, that Fedra was not well stocked for the population of the Pittsburgh quarantine zone. Seems like rations were harder to.
Instead of your lies was one of the things on the wall.
Yeah, exactly. And so I think it's more so hunters had a revolution, but then once Fedra's gone, that ration supply coming in from Fedra HQ is cut off. So now they're living a society that has no supply line. You're in the middle of the city, you're not in farmland, you're not growing things. And so I think that's where the hunters have to adapt to where they have to now become predatory just to survive because their pipeline of survival has been shut off by themselves,
I was
ironically.
going to point that out when we first started talking about Pittsburgh and the atmosphere. So Pittsburgh is an industry town, right? Like you mentioned, this isn't an agricultural place. This has long been a home of American industry, steel in particular. But steel is useful for a lot of things, but
You
you
can't
can't
eat
eat
steel.
steel. You can't eat steel at the end of the day. And so I think that also plays into the interesting relationship that any group surviving and living in the Pittsburgh quarantine zone or Pittsburgh after this, like they're immediately going to deal with some issues that other cities wouldn't have. Primarily like food and supply. There's just a lot of things they wouldn't have immediate access to.
Right. I also wanted to point out this is more about the show. Kathleen has to be, to me, like I don't know that I appreciated it as much the first time, but rewatching it's like for some reason this is one of my favorite antagonists I've
Mm.
seen on screen. And I think it's because she's like a Midwestern character that we've never seen on screen before, being Midwestern scary. And maybe that's just relatable to us.
Being
But
Midwestern
like we
scary
know
in a Midwestern nice way.
exactly.
Well,
It's
she's
like
got this
this is the
sweet little
passive
voice
aggression.
that's, yeah.
Yeah, there's this like passive aggression that we're all familiar with, especially living in Utah, where it's like, I'm
Yes.
not saying what I'm thinking, but I will destroy you with my words or actions. And the dissonance between what she says and what she does feels too real and scary and unpredictable. Yeah, and just like having her aw shucks personality while like popping a doctor in the head, it's like she's wild card almost, and that detachment from any sort of predictability, but in a believable way, makes her
I kind of
terrifying.
feel like the hunters would have to have someone like Kathleen in charge. You know what I mean? Like to keep that group
Mm.
together with what they're about and in the place and time they find themselves. Like you need someone like Kathleen who could be absolutely ruthless and hardcore, but at the same time is savvy enough to rally people when she needs them rallied
Mhm.
for a common cause. So I think Kathleen is brilliant for a number of ways for that. She also, for me, makes the hunters seem much more human, like much more relatable. Without a character like Kathleen, the hunters are kind of this just other group. Yeah, they're just another anonymous group surviving in this dystopian world. But Kathleen gives them a face and a purpose and
A
a
narrative thread to
narrative
Henry and
thread,
Sam,
yeah.
which is
Well, and
great.
I wanted to say like almost an empathy to these otherwise people who might just be fodder in a video game. Like these are just obstacles. These are just enemies for you to kill to get from one place to the next. I think Kathleen makes them much more complex and interesting.
Yeah,
I
one of the most
think
shocking things to playing The Last of Us Part Two is when they start calling each other's names after you
Oh,
shoot them.
ugh, ugh,
Super
If for that
effective.
exact reason, it's
gross.
like, oh, these are actually people. We're getting the
I'm
ground
going to
level
make you feel bad
perspective.
every time you pull the trigger. Yeah.
so I thought it was fascinating with Kathleen how her secondhand man he respects her so much and he's like, what are we gonna do? And
And he's terrified of her.
yeah, he's kind of terrified of her. You can see that. He's a very rough and tough man. He's listening to everything she's saying. He's respecting when she says, hey, we're going to not deal with the ground when the ground is kind of moving. She's like, we're just going to deal with it later. He's like, okay, if you really say so. And I believe he's one of the original actors for the game.
Yeah, he
Oh,
plays
is he?
Tommy in the game.
Tommy,
Oh,
that's what it is.
amazing.
Yeah.
Yeah. So it's really fun to see that little Easter egg of Tommy being in the show as well. I just
Hmm.
love that.
So you'll notice this trope, especially in post-apocalyptic settings, especially with The Walking Dead, where it's often used to demonstrate the pros and cons of different forms of government. In The Last of Us, it's like the reason they're jumping from town to town, and here we're showing authoritarianism, here we're showing democracy, and then they kind of test it with the moral ambiguity of a fallen apart civilization so that they can show hyperbolic scenarios of what works best and what doesn't. I think that's really kind of what they're working at here is we've seen the Fireflies, they're trying to reestablish democracy. You have Fedra, who's authoritarian, and then you have the hunters, which are more closely approximating anarchy and what it looks like to just care about yourself at anybody else's expense. And I don't know that it really lands on any of them being fully correct or fully wrong, which I love because the whole game is the premise is immoral ambiguity, especially in this setting. I also just think it's funny that Joel is just anti all of them.
Yeah.
There's
But he points out the weaknesses in all of them too. Like, I think the game does a good job of showing, there's something to be said about having tanks and the biggest army around and that being a way to rally people. But Joel has a really effective way of pointing out where Fedra goes wrong and why the hunters are ridiculous and why the fireflies are so hokey. Like, he does a good job of not just being anti all group, but he has good reasons for them and he points them out. So I love that he thinks he knows better than all of these organizations.
Yeah, he's being an armchair critic of organizations and
joiners.
I'm smarter than all
bunch
of
of
you.
Loser joiners.
I see through this BS. I've had it all ways.
Bunch of sheep.
Sheeple lemmings.
I think that's probably why this game especially has resonated with gamer community, which has a very strong like populist mentality. Joel is this man that they think that they are or they want to be and haven't been, while also like giving that cynical, a skeptical perspective of the same way that they think about all of these things. So him being taken away, like we'll have to get into that in part 2, but it was really like they were stealing the closest version of themselves portrayed in video games that they saw, even if it wasn't realistic. That's how they thought of themselves, and they didn't want that taken away from them.
Just the rugged individualist.
It reminds me of like this meme I saw 8 years ago. It's we all think we're Jim, but in reality we're Andy.
We all really want to be Joel, but in reality we're like the third clicker, the third person that got bit. Yeah, none of us
had the grit to survive.
No one here is Joel. Let's get that clear. We're all dead. Like
we're the Rat King at ground zero.
Spoiler alert. Yeah. I feel like I need to draw a picture of us all as the Rat King now.
Meanwhile, I see Tucker's face and he's like, I'm going to survive.
I'm the Rat King's left arm. I'm not really in the combat. I'm just kind of there. Take a few swings.
All right, so here in this chapter, Ellie and Joel start finding comic books. I don't remember if they find any before this point. And we also get Ellie, who has discovered a joke book.
Doesn't she have the joke book in the prequel DLC? So I think she's had it for a while. I think the reason it comes up now is because Ellie is starting to feel more comfortable with Joel.
Or she's trying to provoke him and open him up.
Yeah, or try to provoke. But there's one part where it's after a particularly tense scene and Ellie's like, okay, time to diffuse the tension, and she pulls out the joke book. So I think she's had it for a while, but she finally feels like she can start using it now. Because I think if she tried to use the joke book on Joel in the previous chapter, it wouldn't have worked very well.
She, I think her pulling the joke book out of her backpack is also like her opening herself up as well. It's not just about finding the chinks in Joel's armor. I think it's also her being willing to share like dad jokes, stupid, corny jokes. That's something that is probably a little vulnerable for her to share with someone. I don't know until she reaches that point with Joel that she'd be ready to share this.
I want to point out that it is a type of role reversal where you expect Joel to be the one cracking dad jokes, or at least like maybe you don't expect it because you know who Joel is by this point, but traditionally you'd think a dad makes dad jokes. He is not humorous at all. That part of him is shut off forever. And so it's Ellie who has to start bringing him back to like, you can find humor even in a dark place. So I think the joke book was really just her trying to help Joel find his way back to a less cynical version.
Henry also remarks on that when Ellie and Sam are playing, like throwing the blueberries up and it hits her, and Henry remarks that, wow, she doesn't seem fazed by any of this. I think that's a really interesting observation too, how resilient Ellie is to this world. We see other children in this world and other teenagers, and they're not as well adjusted as Ellie is, or it doesn't appear like they are. So it's not just that kids in general are resilient, although I think that there's something to be said about that. But Ellie in particular seems to have a special kind of resilience. I think the joke book maybe has something to do with that, or is maybe, I don't know if one comes from the other, if it's chicken or the egg. But I think the joke book is a great example of her resilience in the face of so much darkness, whether the joke book is her defense mechanism or she uses it as a tool to help others find the resilience she already has.
It really shows how, despite the fact that she's had to grow up so fast, and especially even compared to other kids in the apocalypse, she still had to grow up really fast and she has already faced death and has dealt with all of that. But she still has this youthful, childlike wonder to her. She loves space, she loves comic books, she loves her jokes, and she gets to be a child. And that's something that really helps to bring Joel back. Is I'm sure he's hasn't really been around kids this whole time and he's been avoiding that entirely. And he's only been around grown-ups, and so she kind of brings him back to that childlike wonder in a way, and I think just kind of helps him to rediscover that dad side of him where he just gets to relax and joke around.
So I think you're hitting on the theme on the head for this beginning of the second act, or I guess we're now a chapter or two in, but I think this is the story of Pittsburgh and Henry and Sam, which is her childhood and the loss of that innocence. Because soon after this opening sequence of getting to Pittsburgh, you have Ellie and Joel break off from each other, and the moment that they come back together is Ellie grabbing a gun and shooting a hunter in the head. Why does Joel get mad about that?
It's the loss of her innocence even more.
Well, I have a thought about that. As a parent of two daughters who like to not always listen very well, sometimes I'll tell them something and then they don't, and then they go and they do the opposite thing. I'm like, what did I just tell you? I think that it's a multi-layered reaction from Joel's, because I think that the first layer is that his first thought is he sees, that hunter's trying to drown him, and then Ellie comes and shoots the hunter, and he pops his head up. He's able to breathe again. It saves his life. And his first thought is, what did I just tell you? I told you to stay over there. And that, like, the fact that his life just got saved by her is secondary. And I think that's the surface level that we see as being in charge of taking care of her. He's like, what did I just tell you? And I think the other layer is that he doesn't want to need Ellie. He's relied on partners before. He's relied on Tess, but they're grown-ups that are able to be on equal level with him. And he, at least at this point, doesn't see Ellie that way. Ellie is someone that he's taken care of. They're not equals. He doesn't want to need her help.
I think it's interesting how fast it changes in the game from that point, because it's like right after that, you're out on the balcony and you give Ellie a gun and she's all of a sudden your partner. And she's picking off hunters for you as you're sneaking around.
She's awesome.
So I think,
which is an awesome part of the game.
Yeah, well, I just think it's really interesting. Just like for Joel, I think he has that admission. He's like, you know what? It was me or him. He doesn't necessarily say thank you, but Ellie takes it as a thank you. I think Joel has that reflection. Like the initial thought is, what did I just tell you? As Papa Joel told you to go here because I'm trying to take care of you. And then I think reflecting back, it's like, you know what? Ellie can take care of herself. She mentions this is not the first time I've had to kill somebody at that point. And then I think Joel maybe reflects back and like, hey, you know what? This didn't take her innocence. Her innocence was already gone. Let me now elevate her up to this badassery level that I'm at.
I think it's twofold. Exactly. I think he's angry that she is losing her innocence because he wants to protect that. Just as a father figure, he doesn't want her being exposed to the same darkness that led him to where he's at now. Doesn't want her to become who he is now. He wants to protect the version of her that could be going down the path of being more similar to Sarah as opposed to who he is now. Then second, I think it's like I failed on behalf of Sarah. I wasn't able to protect her, but angry because he was weak again and he almost lost his life because of it. And he doesn't want Ellie seeing that. Like, I think it's a natural instinct that he wants to portray resilience and strength to her, and he failed again. But then realizing that he can be stronger with her. And so the gun symbolizes, up until this point in the entire game, he doesn't trust her. He's very cynical about that relationship, and it's utilitarian. This is, we're partners now, and it symbolizes that trust that they have now established with
it's
each
also
other.
I mean that failure that he experienced with his daughter right off the bat, that still dealing with the trauma and the scars for that. But from the very first time that he and Tess have an experience with Ellie, and it's the soldiers, and she pulls out her knife and kneecaps one of them with it. I think every experience he's had with Ellie, she has proven herself to be capable, like quite capable time and time again. And then when it came to using a firearm, she proved herself yet again to be more capable than he gave her credit for. And whether he's still just dealing with the scars of not being able to save his own daughter, or maybe he's played through how that could have gone differently before, but the fact that Ellie has proven herself more than capable, I think elevates her beyond just, this is a little girl I have to take care of, to this can be, like you said, Shan, this can be a partner.
Yeah.
I really love how in the show they made a couple little changes to Joel where he actually acts his age. And in the game, he's this he's a
He's
superhero in a way. He
unstoppable.
can go through
Yeah.
unstoppable, exactly. He's just mowing down people left and right. But in the show, they tried to make it even more grounded because you're not a video game character. This is now an actual person who has lived 20 years through the apocalypse. I think around the time where they really start to show his age, and they bring it up again later, which we'll talk about in another chapter, but they start to show his age and they start to show the wear and tear on his body. So I think this is when they maybe point out, or it becomes more obvious that he's deaf in one ear, which is important
The
in
end
this
of yeah.
chapter. And so showing how vulnerable he is and maybe starting to realize that he does need to rely on Ellie and he's not young and resilient like he used to be.
All right, he needs to euthanize himself.
That's the right word, right? Yeah.
All right, so Ellie gets the rifle. We go through the financial district, and immediately after, we encounter Henry and Sam. What is the core conflict that we see play out through the entire story arc of Sam and Henry? What is going on between them?
Between Sam and Henry?
Yeah, what is like the underlying subtextual conflict that they're dealing with?
I think it's maybe a slightly more exaggerated version of what's going on with Joel and Ellie. Henry is the protector for Sam, and he wants to keep his little brother safe from everything. And Henry wants to help more, I think, and he doesn't want to be viewed as a kid. Even like the first time they have an interaction with Joel, Sam asks Ellie, "How old are you?" And Ellie says, "I'm 14." And then Sam goes, "Oh yeah, me too." And he's not. He's like 12, I think. And then Henry goes, "Really, you're 14 now?" He's like, "Well, I'm almost 13, or I'm almost 14, or
Well,
something
I'm
like
almost.
that. I'm
Pretty
almost."
close or something.
And so it's like he's just like Sam. Just he's like, I want to help. I'm a big, I can do it, kind of a thing. He wants to be seen as an
my big
equal.
boy pants.
I'm a big boy. He wants to be seen as like a person that can help. And Henry is just not really willing to do that. He just wants to protect him.
I would counter that a little bit because I think the underlying conflict between them is Sam wants to be a kid and Henry is depriving him of that. And
Yeah, it's
so
a little bit of both.
Right, so we see this play out like one of the first scenes that you're talking to Sam and Henry, you go into a toy store. Sam wants a toy. Henry says, "No, don't touch that. We only carry what we need." So we're seeing the ruthlessness of Henry's pragmatism is depriving Sam of his childhood. And we see that play out sequence after sequence until, where Sam and Henry's story comes to an end and he doesn't even want a toy and he ends up throwing it on the ground after Ellie hands it to him, and it's really like his window of opportunity to be innocent has already been taken from him, and Henry, I think, regrets having stolen that from him. In the sewers, when like they're playing soccer, you see it's handled differently because Ellie and Sam are both playing soccer. They're both trying to be kids, and Joel is like, please don't. And he's probably just thinking selfishly of, my daughter played soccer. I don't want you playing soccer because it's reminding me of her. But it's very quick and passing, and then he allows it. Whereas Henry's like, don't do that. You're going to make a sound. Please stop. And it's really just like, because I'm so protective and I'm being a helicopter parent or whatever to his brother, he's deprived of self exploration and fun in his childhood.
So I'd counter a little bit of what you said, Shan. I don't think Henry stole Sam's childhood. I think, in Henry's view, failed at protecting his childhood, and now is overcompensating. Like, okay, I failed at that. I'm not gonna fail again at protecting you. So to protect you, I have to protect your life. We can't carry anything we don't need. We're worried about clickers, infected, making a sound. No, we're going to do this by the book now because something happened where your childhood was already taken away, and I failed at protecting you from that.
Right, but Sam's resentment towards Henry is all because he can't be a child.
Henry's overcorrection of being overprotective to protect him from everything and everything all the time.
Everything everywhere all at once.
Exactly.
Yep. Fantastic movie, 10 out of 10.
So I'm not sure how old Henry is in this show, but I would say probably around 20, and this is 20 years into the apocalypse. So Henry doesn't.
He was a kid when the apocalypse took place. They established that in the game. So he's probably in like his late 20s or early 30s.
It's a huge age gap then, bigger than I realized. But he was a child when the apocalypse broke out, so he was robbed of his childhood, and I don't think he sees the value of needing a childhood, whereas Joel is so much older and he was able to have his own childhood and he knows the value of having that innocence. So I think it's also a difference of their age and where they were when the apocalypse broke out.
The way you treat your first child versus the way you treat your seventh child, right? Like the first child, you're much more tempted to be a helicopter overbearing. My job is to protect this completely helpless flesh bag. Whereas, after 4 or 5 kids, you're like, I'll roll around in the dirt, eat garbage. You'll be fine. Kids are tough.
Exactly.
Yeah, Luke, 6 or 7 kids in your
6.
family. Yeah, and you're the second to
number
last.
5.
I'm second to last out of 5.
How much garbage did you guys eat as children?
All the garbage.
We ate
so much garbage.
Not even junk food, actual garbage.
We ate the garbage of our siblings.
I'm the second oldest, so I didn't eat garbage. I don't have a punchline for that joke. I started it and I thought it would go somewhere and it just didn't.
That is the curse of being the second child.
Yep.
Is you are unfunny and you've never had to compensate for anything.
I'm too pretty. I've never had to be funny. Yep.
Oh, and
I noticed something really cool when Henry and Sam they meet Joel and then they're taking him back and they're like, okay, well, let's go to our hideout and then we'll plan on how to get out of Pittsburgh, like before the big escape scene. They have this really cool moment where Henry and Sam's hideout is in like an architecture office building, and you go into this building and there's all these beautiful like models and drawings and sketches, and it just got me really thinking about how creative and industrious people used to be in this previous world, and then once everything goes crazy, the apocalypse happens, that's just not what they do anymore. And it just made me think about like, well, what do creative people do in this like post-apocalypse world? I'm an artist. I love to draw. I love to animate and create things that way. And it's something that like I get an itch. It's like I need to make stuff sometimes. It's like, how would really creative people, how would this world affect them? Would they still find opportunities to create things, or would the deprioritization of art and creativity drive them crazy and not let them be able to survive in this world? So I wonder if you guys have any thoughts on that. That was something that I was thinking about a lot, is what this world would be like for creative people.
I go back to the Maslow's hierarchy of needs, the pyramid on the guys. Yeah, of just like suddenly all of it, they're down to safety and survival. So I don't even know if they're really thinking of those things. There's maybe some instances where like, man, I'm full, I'm well rested. Yeah, I'd love to create something new. Oh no, there's infected now after me. That's an interesting thought of just where, not just for creative types, but I think for all people, I think you're almost fluctuating on this scale of survival and this innate desire to be human and be an individual and get out of
recreate
survival mode. Yeah, to recreate.
Well, and there's long been that idea that, one generation fights a war so that their children can get an education, so that their grandchildren can be artists. And we've certainly seen that played out in a lot of civilizations throughout history. It's certainly played out here in the United States in the 20th century. People fought wars to produce an economic boon or a period of security so that the next generation could be educated, so the following generation could branch further out into the humanities, arts. And I think creative types exist in every age. Like you said, Eric, there are definitely people who otherwise would be graphic artists and musicians. And there's all types of creative types here in this dystopian future, but the outlet for it has been stolen from them in a way.
Like, Luke, how would you feel if you couldn't
I
write
would,
music?
right?
Would you, in the apocalypse, would
I'd
you
be
just go
like,
crazy, or do you think that you'd be too worried about survival?
that's where it gets really hard for me. I feel like I would have to, if I'm going to survive, I'm going to have to adapt. And that may be like I live a sadder existence than I otherwise would have, or soulless. I would feel like I was missing a limb or something if I couldn't exercise that part of my soul, right? But I think you find a way to adapt. If you're going to survive, you're going to have to put down your pen and pick up a sword.
I mean, we see Joel do that. Joel plays the guitar. There's a creative aspect of Joel that Joel has. And part two, we see there's a creative aspect that gets passed on to Ellie, where she learns the guitar, and that plays a huge role in part two. There's a ton of cutscenes where you're just playing the guitar. And so, yeah, I think you're right, Luke. I think there's this adaptation, but that's still always part of you. I kind of view it as like just this pressure cooker. At some point, there needs to be a release valve, whether that is actually being able to do the creative thing or going crazy.
So, because something's got to keep you grounded to your humanity. Otherwise, what are you living for, right? And I think we experience that tension a lot in this series. We see it in a lot of different examples and a lot of different parts of the story. But that overall tension between what are you even living for? We talked about this in the first episode with Joel. Like when we first see him, the 20-year time jump into the future, and we're talking about taking a shot of whiskey first thing in the morning and possibly ending your own life. I mean, what kind of life is that to even exist? What are you surviving for at this point? If there aren't things that connect to your humanity or to a collective humanity, like music, like any of the arts that connect people to each other on a human level, there's got to be something to live for. And like you said, Tucker, I think that you're going to reach pressure or you're going to blow at some point. And so there has to be a release valve for it.
They do get into this in the TV show of we've established like in the interim, Joel almost took his life and he didn't. And he ended up finding a balance somewhere between the worst of himself and where he is now. But talking with Ellie, and I think she asks to to paraphrase, like, why do you keep going? And he says, you keep going for family, and Tess was family. That is a better narrative thread in the TV show. Like, I think that's what the TV show did best, is like everything that was almost random and eclectic in the game's narrative, like, is more concisely told through, say, a Kathleen of like, why are Sam and Henry escaping the hunters? Oh, here's Kathleen, and it's all tied together. And like, the brilliance of Craig Mazin's writing to just like enhance the narrative thread throughout everything. But I think that really explained Joel's character, whereas it might have been something of a plot hole of like, why did he keep going after he lost Sarah? And we don't know, and he just kind of exists in this moment. Now we know because of the show that it was for family, but he just lost Tess and he's looking for Tommy. In the game, he's not specifically looking for Tommy except to pawn off Ellie, as we find out later. But yeah, do you think his motive for surviving is different in the game?
I just want to give some insight before you guys answer that, but I really love the TV show. And when he has that line later in the show, not in this chapter, where he talks about how he almost tried to unalive himself. Pedro Pascal, the actor, his mom actually unalived herself in real life. So I think that's why that's included. And so when you watch that scene, you can just feel how raw those emotions are and how he just really gets into it. And so I love how they added that extra layer to his character. And I think it was just very personal for Pedro Pascal.
Yeah, he kills pretty much every moment that he's on screen for that show. He does a really great job.
Yes. But go on and answer Shan's question.
Hey, what was it? I don't
Who know? I don't
Forget
even know
about it.
what we're
Pedro
talking about.
Pascal
Video games.
Oh, is Joel's motivation for existing different than it is in the show? Or do we even know why he's still going?
Well, I think at this point in the story, his reason for his existing is starting to shift towards Ellie. I don't know if it's quite there yet, but I think that it's starting to lean that way. But in the meantime, like from the time when Sarah dies up until now, I don't know that I've got a good answer. I think that, again, I'm just going to lean back on Joel being so pragmatic that he's just like almost too stubborn to die. He's like, I'm not going to let this world beat me, kind of a thing.
I think he, at that moment, was tested to his absolute limits of like, I have nothing left. I want to take my life. But then just like his survival instincts kick in, and it showed that survival is more important to him as a human being and to his personality than even Sarah was to him. That even if he has nothing, he still exists for himself.
So I viewed this, and I'm going to do a post-apocalyptic crossover reference here. In The Walking Dead, for as many flaws as that has, I think it's like season 5 or something. I remember watching in college, and it's like the name drop of the show, where they're like walking down
I,
the street,
we're
all
not some
like
kind of Walking
disheveled.
Dead, are we?
Yeah, and basically, I think it's Rick
Rick
who says,
Grimes.
"Oh, we're the Walking Dead," and I think that's kind of like, you're just like,
Oh,
"Oh, they're the Walking Dead. It's not the
oh.
zombies."
Roll credits.
Yeah, but I think like that's kind of Joel in this instance. He's the Walking Dead. He is just there surviving.
He's the last of us.
He's the last of us. He's the last of
Wow!
him.
Whoa!
Name drop.
No, and I think that the zombies themselves, like the fungus, like that is in and of itself a symbolic portrayal of how Joel is now, is that he is just existing. He's no better than the clickers because he has lost all tether to like anything that matters to him, and he's just existing similar to a clicker would.
Well, and one could argue that he is being more almost as damaging to humanity as a single clicker. Like he's leaving quite the body count behind him.
Well, I mean, to Eric's point though, I think that's not too far off because he is rogue living in this world that is trying to reestablish itself. There's conflicts between what that looks like, between the Fireflies, the Hunters, and Fedra, but they all have a common purpose of trying to establish some sort of society, and Joel is living outside of that. And throughout the game, he's actively destroying their intentions.
He's given a middle finger and a knife to the neck to all of them.
Yeah.
Maybe it's partially survivor's guilt. He's already done all of these horrible things, and even though he wants to somewhat end it, at the same time it kind of trying to justify, I did all these things, so I need to keep going to justify trying to survive this long and killing a lot of people along the way.
So I wanted to point out that I think especially this is highlighted in the TV show of like, why did they add Kathleen? How does she help tell Joel and Ellie's story other than just like providing a fantastic narrative thread? But you see that Kathleen and Henry essentially have the same motivation, is they, in an altruistic sense, have placed all of their resources and motivation behind one person, and we see what happens when that one person is taken away from them. In Kathleen's sense, we see, okay, well, if you only care about your brother and your brother's taken from you, who do you become? And that foreshadows who Joel becomes by the end of the show. Conversely, we see Henry taking a similar, albeit like a different conclusion, right? He put everything into Sam, but when Sam is taken from him, what does he do? He takes his life immediately. So we actually kind of see it's almost like a foreshadowing of like which direction is Joel going to do? If he goes down the path of caring about one person like Kathleen or Henry do, which one of these two conclusions is he going to end up with? Is he going to do everything to protect her, or if he loses her because he puts everything in her, what does that look like? And you actually kind of left ambiguously wondering like, how is this story going to end? Probably you're not thinking about it that way, but like I think that's narratively what they were trying to accomplish as writers.
Nailed it.
I agree.
You think so?
Yeah,
I don't have anything. That was so well said. I don't have anything to add to
Yeah.
that. I agree.
Wrap it up.
Yeah.
Wrap that up and give
Episode
it to a
over.
child on
This was
Christmas.
the last episode.
I want to point out he decides to go full Kathleen.
He does, yeah. He absolutely takes shit into his own hands. Yeah.
So we hate Kathleen, and then he goes Kathleen.
Spoiler
All over the
alert,
Fireflies.
but yeah.
Year-old game, and people are listening to this podcast. They probably played it before, probably.
Like,
and if you haven't, that's on you, listeners. That's your fault at this point.
Yeah.
It's also just like, I mean, I'm jumping the gun here, right? Poor use of words, but like, Henry
Pun
Pun intended.
Henry
intended.
taking his
Line
Absolutely.
over it.
it's one of the most evocative, like, and powerful scenes of the entire game is the immediacy between Sam being discovered as infected to Henry taking his life. Like, the most dramatic, intense, what, 20 seconds I've ever experienced in a game. That is starkly showing you how immediately your life can unravel and the bottom fall out beneath you if you put everything in one person and that person is lost. And that increases the stakes for Joel if he decides to do that with
And I
Ellie.
wanted to add a hypothetical here. So if Henry were to discover that Sam had gotten infected, but Joel and Ellie weren't around, or Ellie wasn't in immediate danger or anything like that, do you think it has the same conclusion for Henry and Sam? Like, do you think Henry in that situation, if it's just the two of them, no one else around, they have no other relationship, and he and Henry sees that Sam's infected, do you think he still does the murder suicide scenario, or
I think there's a Walking Dead scene where, like, somebody keeps his daughter alive and chained up.
right?
I think that's what Henry does. Like, I don't know. There's like a I failed my brother, but he only shot Sam because he was
Yeah.
attacking Ellie and he was being pragmatic. They have this whole discussion of, like, are you still human inside? And I think Sam alludes to, like, Henry doesn't believe so, or I don't remember exactly how that conversation plays out. So maybe he just, like, already knows there's nothing left, but I don't know that he could get himself to
And
pull
one
the
other thing,
trigger.
and then I know Eric has something to add, but I was thinking back to that moment where Henry and Sam have Ellie up on the roof and they're ready to peace out and leave Joel, and Ellie goes back down to save
Mm.
Joel. I wonder if there's something how that affected Henry and Sam, right? Because then we don't get to immediately see how they felt about Ellie saying, "Peace out, bozos, I'm with this guy." That when Ellie's life is in danger from Sam, there's something to do with that experience that Henry's drawing from that leads him to save Ellie's life rather than, some other way that could have gone horribly wrong.
Yeah, I want to point out one more thing before somebody else jumps in, but we also just came off the heels of Billstown, and the conclusion of that segment was setting up the stakes for if Joel decides not to adopt, quote unquote, Ellie as his surrogate daughter. And now we're seeing the stakes of if he
Mm.
does. And I think that's the power of putting these two sections back to back,
Chills. That was
right?
greatly put. Yeah.
I took a lot of notes about this situation between Henry and Sam and everyone right at the end there. But I want to backpedal a little bit because I feel like I don't want to skip over this suburbs part because the part where
Yeah,
they're
we
in the
definitely have to talk about it.
sewers, I want to go back and talk. There's so much good stuff in the sewers, but I do have more stuff I want to talk about when we get back to that. But I really deeply enjoyed the sewers section this time, like so much more
Me
than I have
too.
any time in the past. So I mean, so Henry and Sam and everybody, they escape Pittsburgh. That big machine gun car chases them down, but then Ellie jumps in the water and they wash up on the shore. They find Henry and Sam. They all kind of team up again and they go into the sewers. I'm sure that we all found these notes from a guy named
Mm.
Ish.
Let's go ahead and give an overview of the story because it's not a story that you overtly learn by just playing the game. But Ish gets off the boat, he goes into the sewer, he ends up becoming alone, he sees people, he ends up inviting them back. They end up creating this community. You find out later the suburbs that you stumble on the other side of the sewers, he has slowly but surely convinced them all to come live in the sewers with him, that it's more protected because you only have a couple entries and exits that you can protect. And then you see that he's formed some kind of protective detail. He's partnered up with somebody he's become romantic with, and they've established this, like, community. It focuses a lot on the children. The most important thing to take away from Ish's story is the focus on the children, on educating them and what life looks like for them. They grew up in this world, and so they only know animals that are rats. And so you see rats drawn all over the walls. You see their form of, like, education. I was really taken aback by thinking in my head, okay, ever since the beginning of this game, where they poured a lot of detail and time into it, this is the second most detailed sequence in the game now up until this point is. And so I'm wondering, why did they focus so much time, so much money, and so much developer resources on telling this story that you choose to engage with, and what does that add to the story?
So I think the choice to interact with it, I think is actually key because to me, it puts the player into that world. The player can be pragmatic, run through it for survival, or the player can choose to focus on humanity and understanding the world, understanding other people. For me, every time I've gone through it, I've been pragmatic. It's okay, cool. There's some drawings. That's sad. There's kids here. Whatever. Let's go. We got to survive. I'm sure probably everybody else but me took their time in this area, actually looked around. And so it's really interesting because I think it's just another immersive element where the player has to act like they're in that world and make that choice to choose humanity or push through pragmatically.
Right. And it's not just that you can find a bunch of collectibles and there's a ton of optional things to find and pick up, notes and the machete, which is not just it's just super cool. It's also like the first real weapon you find, like melee weapon, other than like bricks and bottles and things to toss around. You get a machete. So it's not just about like I can wander around here and pick up resources that are useful for me as the player to progress in the game. Your engagement with the story, your buy-in as the player into the story, making it more personal, looking at every single note, looking at the drawings and that stain on that blanket that you just know came from some tragic experience, those kinds of things, all of that, making you encounter it as the player on your own terms, I think makes it super, super personal. Because my version of Joel, me wandering around the sewers, me, Luke, was different than the way Eric did it. I probably did it in a different order, but even if we found all the same things in the long run, like there's something about it that makes it more personal to me and my playthrough this time that wasn't the same as anyone else's playthrough because I got to encounter it on my own terms.
I also want to underscore like this continues to enhance the theme of this section, which is childhood, because it focuses so much on the children in the, well, are they sewers or are they a maintenance tunnel? In the show, they more specifically call it a maintenance tunnel. But yeah, I just want to like say that it's showing a version of childhood that focuses on games and on like they have these playhouses and everything, and it shows the flourishes of an indulgent childhood, which again acts as this friction between Sam and Henry and the stakes of Ellie preserving her innocence, which we're already starting to lose because of her getting the gun and taking life.
I want to compare this section to Zelda Tears of the Kingdom. And we've had this conversation, Shan, where basically you go down into the depths and it's so mind-boggling at first how vast and cool it is to have this extra layer to the game. And after probably an hour or so, it's so boring and the depths really add nothing to the game. And it's really sad because they could have done so much more to it, but it's just repetitive, just going through and lighting up these sections and picking up stuff and battling monsters. And so it just made me think of that game where it's so impressive at first and then it adds absolutely nothing. But with this game, you're in these tunnels underground and you're like, okay, this is just another area, but you don't think there's anything to it. But then picking up all these letters from Ish and looking at all the little details left behind, they really went out of their way to add so much color and depth to the game and to the world building. It's just a huge difference between the two games of what they did with these underground areas.
So I was going to say, it has so much to do with that relationship you have. I mean, that's devastating for anyone because you as the player, you're filling in all these blanks and you're adding all the contextual cues together. And you're kind of experiencing that story all in your brain all at once, washing over you, rather than the way that a video game normally plays out, which is those long linear stories you're following. But the personal touches there, right? Like the children under the blanket, the note that you find next to them and on the wall, and in every corner of the sewers, anywhere where those children are. I think I could spend another couple of hours just exploring those rooms, and you're going to find more stories like that. Some that maybe aren't as explicit that have a note, because that note gives you a lot of context to fill in the blanks to what happened there. But even if there wasn't that note, you could walk in and just see that scene and guess. You could have guessed what happened. They just do a fantastic job of adding those personal touches in the sewers. Now I want to go back and replay the sewers, and I'm sure there are things I didn't see, I didn't catch.
I had never before connected that the suburbs that's where all the people came from that congregated in the sewer until you find Ish's note when you get out and says, oh, it's all been lost. And you find out how it happened is somebody left a door open. I wouldn't say this is telling like the same dramatic Fedra versus Fireflies versus Hunter story, but it is really just saying if you are with people, you are only as strong as your weakest person. I think Joel already understands that. I don't think it's like elevating his knowledge, but it's still just like explaining that to the character. Another reason that he's cynical about organizing with other people.
And I think just also showing the fragility of society in that instance. It's one mistake by one person caused the downfall.
Also, okay, so I have to call out something that caught me off guard even while I was in the sewers was how elaborate the entire system was, where they have the water collection system and the water storage and like all of these things that would make it realistic. And they don't gloss over anything. Like there's the porta potties in a row, and it's almost as if somebody had to like construct this out and then play through their head like, okay, could I survive one day in here? I have everything for that. Could I survive 1 week in here? I have everything for that. And just kind of continued layering it on until it was like a practical habitation. I also just want to point out that I was listening with my 3D audio earphones for the PS5 and going to the water collection room, it's like you could hear the pitter patter of individual raindrops specifically placed in front of you where it was happening. And just like I don't know, Luke, have you looked into like the science of how you're able to place sound like that? How does
So,
that
okay,
work?
we've mentioned this in a conversation that we've had before, but humans are really bad placing things in a vertical space, right? The way that our hearing has evolved, we're really good at detecting where something is coming from in a horizontal plane, but verticality is really hard for us. I mean, the theories have to do with us not having a whole lot of aerial natural predators. And so really our hearing evolved to protect us in a horizontal plane, which makes a lot of sense. But when it comes to sound design, when it comes to how they're able to help us hear something that is in front of us, behind us, or above us, or below us, that's where it gets really fascinating. So for them to be able to place the raindrops falling on top of you, so it doesn't sound like it's just coming from your right or your left or below you, but distinctly above you, the way that they're able to pan certain sounds into a sphere so that it sounds distant enough far right or far left that your ears tricked into hearing it above you or below you, it's brilliant. Plus, you're able to create in these 3D spaces, you're able to create an epicenter for those sounds so that as you're the character and you're looking left or right and you're moving around, not only are you hearing an epicenter of sound in a horizontal plane, but the way that the sound is panned in those 3D spaces allows you to also trick your brain into thinking you're hearing it in a vertical plane. It's really cool.
I don't know how they do it, but as a developer, if I had to put my head in the space of like, how do you design this with code? What I'm guessing is they start with just a raw recording, and then the sound engineers come up with distortions that they can use to layer onto the audio. And if I had to guess, they're using the same path tracing algorithm that like an NPC would use to follow you to be like, okay, what's the closest point between you as a character and this NPC, and follow the path, find out which directions it goes to, and then layer on the distortion on top of that so that it sounds like and then they probably have like distortions or filters that they put on to be like, okay, this is a brick room, this is a metallic room, this is an echoous room, and they just keep layering on those filters until it sounds like they're specifically 2 rooms away with metallic surfaces or whatever, and that's how they're able to always make it feel like it's spatially a certain distance or in a
It's a
certain room.
crap ton of math and a crap ton of layers on top of each other. I mean, it really is. It's just a crap ton of math, everyone. Look it up, do the math. But I mean, the way that
Thank
sound
you.
travels, how fast, but
Layman.
the way sound travels, how fast it travels, and how much it distorts based on that distance. I mean, you can trace it all algebraically, and it's pretty regular. In order for them, like you said, to make it sound like it's bouncing off a brick surface or a metal surface or a combination of those surfaces, that's where, even though the math is pretty straightforward, the way to design it so that the player can explore that space and for it to remain dynamic 3D spatially, that kind of stuff takes a whole lot of detail, a crap ton of math, and a whole lot of layers. And so, I mean, they could have just dropped a sound, the epicenter of a sound in that room, and they could have just left it distant wise. So you could hear it in the distance. But the fact that it bounces off of different types of surfaces, there's so many layers involved in it, which is probably why on your PC, the game is such a high, like we talked about this, the demands on your PC are so incredibly high, not just from a graphics perspective, but the computing power it takes to run all of those algorithms and all of those calculations at the same time in a really graphics intensive environment. I mean, it's immense, but it's beautiful attention to detail.
Yeah, I can't recall a game with better sound design, or at least one that I was so enamored of or so captivated by because it demanded my attention. A lot of times it can just be like something that you passively consume because it's just status quo. But like this one, like they clearly had math and the science behind like how to make this special because sound is one of the most critical gameplay elements and mechanics to the whole game, especially because I kept forgetting that like the first time you play the game you use the visual placement of listening to be able to see characters through walls, and it's this little hacky thing which is great for like people who need it. But once I got the headphones on, I realized I prefer listening and figuring out where people are, and that the other thing is a crutch and it's not as fun. So I really love playing with the
It's a
3D
much
audio.
more immersive game mode to just rely on your headphones and don't even use that listening mode at all.
So it's really fascinating how with sound is so important in this game because the infected in the game also rely so heavily on sound because you have the clickers and other type of infected in this game that have the mushrooms coming out of their faces and they actually lose the ability to see you whatsoever. And so I just think it's really cool how they put so much effort into the sound design.
All right, so now we get out of the sewers and we are in the suburbs and we encounter a sniper. I love in the television series that they use this to connect back to the hunters and to Sam and Henry's storyline, to say it's like an old man that is connected to the hunters, and that's where all of their resources are at right now. So again, it's just like the brilliance of the writing to just say like everything that happened in the game, there's like a story thread that connects all of it. I love that nonsense. This was one of the most memorable sequences to me from the first time I played the game. I guess it's kind of like The Last of Us 2 when Tommy's trying to gun you down when you're running up the bridge. But like, is it just because I've never seen something like this before? I've never been on the receiving end of a sniper. Why was it effective for everyone else?
I've never been on the receiving end of a sniper, not that I know of.
Except like maybe in Halo multiplayer.
Except in a video game. But in real life, that would be petrifying to me. In fact, for all I know, I have been, and the trigger just wasn't pulled, thankfully. But
I think it's effective because like you've never before been in a situation where you're being sniped, but you're also forced because of the story to go towards the sniper. And so it's like the amount of like space that you allow yourself between gunshots to advance a small amount, it increases the tension so high. Snipers are going to kill you in 2 shots.
depending on the difficulty you're playing, you only get one.
To me, it's an interesting, just not really character dynamic, but different. Going back to the theme of where we talking about combat, how each different enemy you take something away. With this, your partner is taken away, left without any support. You've played this whole series either with you and Ellie, you and Sam, or as a group of 4, and now it's okay. It is up to Joel to save the day because that's it.
Also,
It's
until
you
you
or
get in the
Ellie.
house, you are incapable of shooting that man.
Yeah,
So you are
yeah.
forced to walk into danger. I don't know if this is the right time, but I just love in this game, especially for a sort of survival game, that the resource management and care that you have to put in like feels a lot more grounded than anything I've ever played. Like I've played all the Resident Evil games, but like one bullet to the head of an enemy does kill it is incredible, but that also allows them to give you much fewer bullets, which makes the bullets and the resources even more scarce. So just like it's the best balance I've ever felt in a survival game. Even in Resident Evil, it's like, okay, some of these are sponges. I have to get quite a bit of ammo, and so it doesn't feel as survival. You're not managing 5 bullets at a time.
Yeah, a
But
wasted bullet from the revolver is just a gut punch every time, where it's like I got this lined up, and then oh
I mean,
yeah,
like,
oh I'm
I
done.
found myself
Ugh.
restarting
I'm gonna reload.
checkpoints just because I knew I could be more efficient. Like if I wasted a bullet or two on an
Yeah.
enemy, I was like, I'm just gonna restart the whole checkpoint because I'm not gonna waste those two
I was
bullets.
I was playing all the Resident Evil games on Shan's Steam Deck, and I relied so heavily on save state, and it just got to the point because I got really far into the first game that I was playing. It was Resident Evil Remake. And I kept running through my bullets and I couldn't find anything anywhere. I didn't know what I was doing. I ran out of ammo. I didn't know that the zombies would come back to life. I think the
the
Crimson
Crimson
Head.
Heads.
I didn't know I could light them on fire, so I kept circling this mansion over and over again, and they kept reanimating, and it was just like it was so frustrating. And so I learned to use save state, and I would go into a room and I would waste like 3 bullets, and I'm like, "No, I can't do that." And so I would immediately revert back, and I would try it again, and I would learn the patterns. And I did this with every single room and enemy. I was trying to conserve all my ammo. And yeah, I
Yeah,
really love this game, how
I, th-
real I didn't have to do that.
Peak efficiency.
I think the greatest loss for survival games was the PS5 with instant reloading. Like The Last of Us Part 2 was the first time where it's like, oh, I made a mistake. Okay, well, that's only going to set me back 30 seconds because reloading a save takes 1 second. You really need the stakes of the permanence of death. If it takes 30 seconds to load as opposed to 1 second, it's so much more devastating if you die. And so the tension gets so much higher. Where here it's like, oh, I shot one bullet incorrectly. I'm going to go back 30 seconds. All right. So you get up, you take out the sniper, then the hunters come a hunting and the clickers. And at this time, Sam gets overtaken. He gets bitten on the leg, but you don't find out until later. And the show and the game both capture this moment brilliantly. The punctuation mark on Sam and Henry's story. Ellie and Henry are his only two authority figures in his life, and they both take away his hope. And like knowing how his story ends just makes it tragic. There's no, at least he was happy at the end. He just has everything taken away from him.
I loved in the show how Ellie has the idea that she can use her blood to save
Hmm.
Sam. I love that idea for so many reasons because we're reminding ourselves that the reason originally that Joel and Tess were trying to smuggle Ellie out of there was because she can be some magic unicorn cure for the world potentially, and it's a way to keep that thread alive. But it also kind of dawns on you right there that Ellie, like, does Ellie feel the gravity of what potentially she could be for humanity if it was true that her blood could be a cure for this kind of infection? And the fact that she's willing in that case to like actually bleed herself to save Sam. There's just so much about that gesture that I find really thoughtful, really beautiful, and we learn a lot about who Ellie really is as a person and her selflessness with that kind of gesture. I love that moment. I love that idea.
Right, so they do it differently between the game and the show. Ellie never finds out until the next morning, and they all
Yeah.
find out. In the show, he just tells her, and it plays out differently. It does have the same conclusion, right? Because this is one of the critical beats of the second act, where this Sam and Henry storyline is the catalyst for both Joel and Ellie. For Joel, it's these are the stakes if you place all of your survival and instincts into protecting someone else. But for Ellie, it's these are the stakes if you don't make it. So like she doesn't know at this time, of course, that it would mean sacrificing her life. It's You have to remind yourself if you played this 4 or 5 times that there's no sense of like, okay, I can save everybody, but it's at the cost of my own life. She just thinks I can save everybody. The moment of no return, where Joel is going to go down the path of becoming endearing as a patriarchal figure to her. And this is where she's not coming back to, I have to do everything to save everyone because like saving even someone like Sam is enough to put them above myself.
This just reminds me of the DLC when you play Left Behind with Riley, how they both got bit and she couldn't do anything about it. And they just decide, let's just lose our minds and together and we'll both turn into infected. Wouldn't that be poetic, right? But they just kind of give up because what else do you do? But then when she deals with this with Sam and she actually sees this glimmer of hope of, wait, I can do something about it. And then it doesn't work. And it's really sad that I think it was almost a redemption for her in a way of, I wasn't able to do anything about Riley, but I can do something about Sam. And then it gets taken away from her. And I think that adds to her desperation much later on when she realizes that she could sacrifice herself. And it's her constantly clinging to, I can do something about this. And I'm the reason why other people didn't make it.
I think without Sam, she maybe would have cared more about Joel to the point where she wouldn't be thinking about sacrificing herself. It is Sam that cements her destiny in sacrificing and wanting to sacrifice herself for more meaning.
So
I think
I
he
think
just
it's
had to take ownership of his failure, but go on, Tucker.
oh no, I was gonna say like kind of to me it was very Old Yeller reminiscent of it's
Okay.
of just like hey this
Dehumanizing,
is
but yes, go on.
well no it's just like hey this is my responsibility, it has to be me, I have to see this through to the end. And in that moment it's like I'm yelling at Joel like Joel, just grab your gun, take this shot from Henry and save Ellie. But kind of the point I wanted to bring up is it hit me as we were talking about the sewers is I think maybe some of Henry's motivation is like, you know what? Joel took care of Sam in the sewers. I now have to take care of Ellie. But to take care of Ellie, I have to sacrifice Sam. Sam's already gone. And there's, I think, maybe this moment of realization is I almost have to repay, but if I shoot Sam, there's nothing else to live for. And then comes the suicide part of the murder suicide.
Was it he shoots at the ground when Joel tries to pick up a gun? Maybe he's still in the denial phase of like my brother is actually gone,
He's
but
processing still.
he's still processing, and the acting of going through that traumatic response is, I think, like both in the game and on screen, it really cements Henry as one of the finest characters. It's also just like him demonstrating you don't like, I don't think it was an option. He proves he couldn't allow Joel to pull the trigger on his brother. Try to play that out in your head, and it just like it doesn't make sense to the scene, and maybe because we've already seen the conclusion, but Henry allowing Joel to shoot his brother just seems impossible. And the difference between the game and the show is like when he's in that traumatic response, in the game he says, Joel, this is your fault, but in the show he's just traumatized, and I think he owns the decision and he believes it's actually his fault. I was curious, I actually thought I was caught off guard, maybe it's just he's in trauma, but like why did he even blame Joel in the first place? I didn't understand how that happening. Is it because he didn't protect him when the snipers were coming, if he knows that's when it happened, or when the cordyceps were coming?
I had the same impression there. I mean, enough time elapses where he's pointing the gun at Sam and we don't let Joel shoot Sam, where he's going through a lot in his brain, but he has the wherewithal to pull the trigger and take accountability for it all at once. It's not a reactionary thing. When Sam is on Ellie, he doesn't just immediately pop. Like it doesn't happen as a gut reaction. He's present in his head and in his feelings and in his thoughts. And so when he does have the gun on Joel and he looks down, I had the exact same thought. I thought he was still having the conversation with himself in his head, and he took ownership and
Playing
accountability.
out the scenarios like, what do I have to do?
Exactly. Yeah, I think he was in his head and he'd already had the conversation. So when he said this is your fault, that was the conclusion he had come to after that long conversation in his head. It's just like so much time elapses there. Yeah, it's interesting.
Well, I think it's interesting because, like, I think we've all at one point had those super rapid but long conversations with ourselves in our head.
Yeah.
And just like part of the brilliance of the remastered game is you can kind of see that happening with the micro expressions.
Yeah, he goes through like 5 different stages of grief or whatever within a couple seconds. It's incredible.
Yeah, so like I mean, like I mentioned before, I think the way this whole chapter at the end plays out makes the game worth every penny to me because it's just a totally different feeling than the PS4 or PS3 version where like yeah, it's tragic, that's sad, but this is like you feel it more in your core that like oh, like this is real emotional.
Devastating.
This is real hard. Would I be able to do this?
I would be remiss if I didn't call out the sequence in the show where they all emerge from the ground.
Yes, I was thinking the same thing. I'm like, do I bring it up?
A couple things I'm remiss in that we haven't talked about is one that, and then just the cordyceps mechanics in the show that are not in the game of cordyceps being able to communicate with each other.
The physicality that they portray in the show that's different from the games, and really because it's not canned animations, but like I am fascinated by the mechanics of how they move because they have an impulse and they thrust themselves in that direction until something else stops them. And then they recalculate. So it's like stimulus reaction. And so it's like there was it the first episode there was a moment where someone's being chased through a restaurant and this cordyceps bolts through a door and then like flies over the counter of the restaurant and then he gets up and he jumps through. I love the stimulus reaction and then following it through without even reacting to anything else in between that initial reaction and until they're stopped. And that really just makes them feel more threatening of these things are unstoppable and they're horrifying. And that same thing can be done with their arms is when they have a stimulus to thrust their arms, it moves their whole body with them and they move with it until physically they are stopped by how their body is held together. It's a full follow through.
Yeah, it's all or nothing.
It's
They're not
gorgeous.
playing chess when they throw their body into it. Yeah.
Yeah, it's just not refined movement or motor skills. It's just gross motor all the way through.
Is this the first time we see a boomer in the show? I'm trying to remember.
Boomer? You mean a bloater?
A bloater, sorry, yeah.
Oh,
Yeah,
What?
this
okay,
is it.
Boomer. Oh,
okay,
boomer.
Yes, this is the first time we see.
Okay, yeah,
I love
yeah.
it.
So they kind of have the same like mechanics coming out of the ground as you kind of have seen in World War Z, where it's just like this chaotic climbing on top of each other, just explosion of frenetic energy. It's fun in World War Z, but it doesn't feel real. Maybe because it's CGI, things aren't connected the way that they should be, and there's not a simulated reaction of character to character as they're climbing on top of each other. Whereas like I think everybody has seen the behind the scenes for this episode where they're using real people. And so that chaos of running over each other probably enhanced with CGI, but there's a lot of motivated and real chaos of them colliding with each other that grounds it in the scene and makes it feel so horrifying and real.
Props to the fight coordinators who had to deal with all that, because watching the behind the scenes footage and how they had to capture all of that is so cool.
The bloater coming out of the ground, obviously we've seen that this is somebody in a giant prosthetic suit. One of the most impressive prosthetics I've ever seen. I would compare it to like Brendan Fraser in The Whale. It's not just a prosthetic, there's an actual weight that you feel. Like the slowness of his movement. If this thing lands a punch, my head's flying off. So they really captured the weightiness with that prosthetic. But I also just like with the backdrop of the fire and the way that the camera is able to capture the low lighting. And I just love when the bloater comes up, you see the fire behind it, and you see the subsurface scattering of its cordyceps growing out of its head. And the subsurface scattering is like when you hold a flashlight to your fingers and you can see the skin and the blood through your finger. You can see the prosthetics are so realistic. You see through their prosthetics as if it were flesh or fungi of some sort. This is like the difference between a Bethesda game and any modern game. It's like the reason that their skin looks plastic or rubbery is because they don't have subsurface scattering or they have like a paucity of detail in the texture of the skin. So you don't see pores and stuff like that. But the hallmark of this game and the show is that the fine texture work and the subsurface scattering that makes these faces feel realistic. And they also have subsurface scattering and the eye reflections on the specular highlights so that you see that there's almost like a depth to their eyes. All these like little nuanced artistic moments make these feel like the most human humans you've ever seen in a game.
I'm going to bring in my little expertise. That it just makes me think of this as a sugar artist, is that you see a lot of people doing these hyper realistic faces, and they use modeling chocolate that's very opaque. But I have a friend that makes some of the most hyper realistic faces I've ever seen, to a point that it's uncanny valley, and a lot of people don't like her work. It creeps them out. You should see the comments she gets sometimes. But she is one of the best artists I've ever seen. And I've taken classes from her. She's one of my friends. And the difference between her work and others is that she uses this Mexican brand of modeling chocolate that's more translucent. And so I'm sure if you
You get
looked
the
at these,
subsurface scattering.
yeah. And so I'm sure if
Yeah.
you look at the prosthetics like really up close, they're using something that's a bit more translucent versus opaque. And that's what gives you this hyper realism that really just, in a way, creeps you out.
It's like you even see it here. Like it's not just the light coming through your ears. You also get it in the flesh, and it's how you see like the red blood cells through your cheeks and stuff. And so it's like the difference between just like a flat matte skin texture versus like feeling like you can see blood when light is shining on a person's skin. And that just like really makes them feel human. It's brilliant.
Yeah, it makes a huge difference. And my friend who also does this hyperrealism, she puts so much thought into it. It's insane. I think she said she might be autistic or Asperger's. I don't remember, but it really would. She says that to me, saying this is why I know this so well and why I'm so hyper focused on making real faces. But she does tiny little layers of color. And so it's like all these colors I didn't even realize I needed to use. So I think we started with tiny little dots of purple. And then we had like little tiny dots of, I think, orange. And then we did another wash of color over that. So I think there was at least 3 to 4 layers of color that I never realized was so involved in creating realistic faces. I would love to get into special effects makeup because I love all of that so much.
Don't know that I have an answer, and I'm trying to figure it out as I go, but Kathleen, she dies by the hands of the zombie child. Why was that her end? Typically, a character who deserves to die dies at the hands of the person who deserves to deal that death. But we don't know this zombie child. So why was a zombie child used to attack her and take her out? Does that tie into like her flaws as a character and a catharsis, that being the thing that takes her life?
In a way, I'm going to say yes, because maybe they included the child character as a reference to the video games, where that might have been one of the children that Ish was taking care of that maybe tried to escape and then ended up being taken over and turned into a zombie. It's the consequences of not taking care of your own. Unfortunately, they got overrun by someone leaving a door open or ignoring the responsibilities. And then Kathleen, she also ignored her responsibilities, and now she's getting the consequence of the consequence.
I think I have the answer, and I'm going to make it as quick as possible, but I think what's happening is that Henry doesn't deserve to take Kathleen because he's already in this situation because he killed her brother. So him also killing Kathleen wouldn't have any kind of poetic ending. I think the child has to take its life because it's not going to be Sam, but her entire thing is, I'm going to kill Sam because you killed my brother, and children just die. She makes a big aside about this of like, children die, that's just life, and you've messed with destiny, whereas my brother didn't have to die. You robbed him of his destiny by interfering and taking his life. So I think it was really like a kid has to take her life because of her ruthlessness and apathy towards saving Sam's life. That might be how it's all tied together. Let's call it there. Next week, we are going to Tommy's Dam outside of Jacksonville. And we also pass through the university. All right, so we'll be getting to that next time, and I'll talk to you all next week. Bye.
Bye.
Outro. Bleepity-doof, bleepity, bloopity blow.